Hey Axis and Allies players, the good captain here. Welcome to the 10th and final video in my Axis and Allies 1914 series. The primary focus of this video is going to be a discussion around balance in 1914. However, in the same spirit as the final video in my Axis and Allies anniversary series, I'm going to cover a range of different topics. So I'm first going to open with an agenda, and I'm going to put timestamps for each of these topics in the description box below, so if any of them are uninteresting to you, you can skip ahead. First, I'm going to update my resume as regards to games played of 1914. Then I'm going to move into the primary discussion, which is one on balance. This game is unfortunately imbalanced, so I'm going to do my best to demonstrate where and how you can see it. I'm then going to move into a discussion on how I think it's best to fix it. We'll then do some Q&A and cover some topics that weren't discussed in the strategic videos. And then we'll wrap up with some well-earned shoutouts to some of the players who helped make this video series possible. So when it comes to updating my 1914 resume, I've now completed 52 games of Axis and Allies 1914. I completed all but one of these games on the AAA platform. I'm not going to go into as much detail as I did about this in the first video. Suffice to say that I feel that anytime someone is going to recommend strategy or especially talk about balance, they should be very clear about their experience with the game. We'll now move to a discussion around the imbalance in 1914, but to have this discussion, I think it's best that we turn the camera around and take a look at the game board. So before I begin, I just want to say as a disclaimer that I'm not saying this is a definitive way to demonstrate imbalance. I do think it is a useful tool to provide perspective. This is something I did in Axis and Allies Anniversary, and I do feel that it goes a long way to help demonstrate at least a potential economic imbalance in any economy-based version of Axis and Allies. So with that out of the way, let me tell you about what I have set up on the board here. I believe this is a fairly realistic snapshot of game turn 11 or 12 of an out-of-box version of Axis and Allies 1914 when all sides are manned by players with 10 out of 10 experience. So just to go through this, I think by game turn 11 or 12, it's extremely reasonable to expect Austria and Germany to have split up Russia in some way. I think it's reasonable that the UK has seized all of the territories up to Constantinople. The USA has taken Spain. One of the Entente powers has taken Spanish Morocco. And though it's off screen, the Entente have secured all of Africa. By this point in the game, the Central Powers navies have been swept from the seas, and there's likely heavy fighting going on somewhere in this area of the board. That's between Venice and Alsace and possibly all the way up to the Ruhr. So this, in my many games of experience against many different opponents, is a fairly typical game turn 11 or game turn 12. This is what I like to call the mid-game. In most versions of Axis and Allies, this is where the initial blitzkrieg of the Axis, or Central Powers in this case, armies have gone out, got the territories they needed to get, and the game is moving into its later stages. This is where good or bad dice, or just playing experience, should break the game in favor of one side or the other. And I think it's important at this point in the game to take a hard look at the game economy. In other words, how many IPCs are the Entente collecting as a whole versus how many IPCs are the Central Powers collecting as a whole? And when you add up all the IPCs of Germany, Austria, and the Ottomans in this board state and compare it to the UK, France, Italy, and the USA, the Entente are going to be pulling 116 IPCs off the board every turn, while the Central Powers will be pulling off 95. That is 21 IPCs in favor of the Entente. And though this by itself is not necessarily proof that the game is imbalanced, after all, the Central Powers armies could be much, much stronger at this point in the game than the Entente. In my 52 games of experience, the opposite has been shown to be true. In point of fact, when playing with out-of-box rules, I have never lost as the Entente. Not only have I never lost, I've never even come close to losing. This is even after playing players that I feel are more experienced and better than I am at playing the Central Powers. So my conclusion here is that at the very least, when we get to this point in the game, that economic disparity is extraordinarily unhelpful and a huge part of the reason why the rest of this game is generally predetermined. I have one final caveat to mention before we move into a discussion on how I think best to fix this game. And that is to state for the record that the majority of the games that I played as the Central Powers, I actually won with out-of-box rules. but I feel very strongly there's a very simple reason for this, and that can be summed up in one word: experience. Experience by itself is the greatest equalizer when determining how to balance any version of Axis and Allies. This topic will get its own video in the future on this channel. I just want to state that here now to help provide context to my record for the Central Powers. So, if you feel as I feel, that this game is imbalanced and that it favors the Entente, what are the best remedies to balance the game and make it more fun for everybody? Before I make my recommendations for how to balance Axis and Allies 1914, I want to make clear how I feel about making modifications to any version of Axis and Allies that's perceived to be imbalanced. And I like to use the analogy of a dentist who has found a cavity in one of his patients. And in that case, and in this one too, what we're looking to do is make the least amount of modifications or changes to the game possible and preserve as much of what was already there. As two examples of this, I have done a deep dive on Axis and Allies Classic and feel that that game is practically balanced by using two optional rules from the back of the book and disallowing the invasion of neutrals. When it comes to Axis and Allies Anniversary with the 1941 setup, I feel that adding 2 infantry in key spots for the Allies balances the game. 1914 is more egregiously imbalanced than either of those two games, and so in this case I have 5 recommended rules changes that, in my strong opinion, bring the game to balance, or near balance, without being offensive to the original game concept and game design. I will make these recommended optional rules available in the description box below, and I will also post them on axisandallies.org. So I'll go through each of these recommended rules, but I'm also going to explain the implication on the game. In other words, I'm going to explain why this change was made based on my experience against all of these opponents and those 52 games I mentioned earlier. And just to clear the air before I begin, I will say that I feel that every version of Axis and Allies 1914 should use the Russia Revolution rule. So with that all out of the way, my first recommendation for an optional rule that helps balance the game is to have the USA start with 0 IPCs and go to war at the beginning of game turn 5. The original rule is that it starts with 20 IPCs and enters the war at the beginning of game turn 4. So this rule effectively has the Americans come in with the exact same amount of IPCs, just 1 turn later than normal. I feel that American influence always feels a turn too early and a bit too strong in the original game. And making this modification is very subtle. And in the spirit of making very subtle changes, this being 5 turns into the game, we haven't really changed anything except the point at which American troops hit the ground. The second rule change I think is necessary for balance is to forbid the invasion of neutral territories that did not start the game aligned. There's at least 2 reasons to disallow the invasion of neutral nations like Spain, Spanish Morocco, and Greece. And the first and most important reason is that allowing the invasion of neutrals seems to benefit the Entente far, far more than it benefits the Central Powers. There's one exception by necessity to this rule, and that is Persia. Obviously, Persia needs to be able to still be attacked in order for the game to function and flow correctly as it was originally intended. Otherwise, the direct impact from this is with regards to IPCs for the Entente. By not allowing the British to take Afghanistan, the Americans to take Spain, and one of the Entente players to take Spanish Morocco, you're denying them at least 6 IPCs. If you recall back to earlier in the video, the Entente can expect to make 116, while the CP only make around 95 on game turn 11 or 12. So this would reduce the Entente from 116 to about 110. And not to go off onto a third rail, but removing the ability of anyone to move into Switzerland and Greece seems to make the game far more enjoyable, as well as far more historically accurate, if anyone's into that. And before continuing, I will say that if I could convince you of only using 2 of these optional rules, these would be them. Forbid the invasion of neutral countries that didn't start the game aligned, and have the United States start with 0 IPCs and enter at the beginning of their turn 5. This will go a long way to creating a balanced game. My final 3 rules recommendations all have to do with this area of the board. So the next one I'm going to review is the Dardanelles being closed to sea movement barring control of Constantinople. So the way this rule works is that Entente ships are free to move into Sea Zone 20 They can amphibiously assault Constantinople. However, they cannot move through C-Zone 20 into 21, nor can they amphibiously assault Ankara or Mesopotamia. This rule leaves the Gallipoli option open to the Entente player, but the main reason I recommend it is because one very popular move for the Entente is to send transports through this strait into C-Zone 21 and land nuisance raids in the rear areas of the Central Powers. The CP needs every man they can get, and forcing them to garrison these rear area territories is just a bit too much to ask. My fourth optional rule recommendation is to move the line of C-Zone 17 from the border of Tuscany, Naples, and Trieste, Albania, down to the boot heel of Naples, to the border of Albania and Greece. It might be best to create your own overlay, but I will identify it here with a small strip of paper. The main problem with this situation is that C-Zone 17 becomes far too powerful. With so many transports of various nationalities, Albania essentially becomes what I call the ulcer of the Central Powers. It's an easy entry and exit point to get troops in and out. With plenty of battleship and offshore support, there's very little risk for the Entente to force landings there, and the debilitating effect it causes on the Central Powers is, in my opinion, part of the imbalance in this game. Some of the second and third order effects of this is that the Austro-Hungarian Navy now has a few more options available, given that Naples is included in its area of influence. But even after the Austro-Hungarian Navy has been removed, Albania is still a viable target. You just have to make the mine roll to get in there. In my playing experience, this helps make this area of the board far more interesting and fun and competitive for all sides. And my fifth and final rules recommendation to balance Axis and Allies 1914 is to reduce both Piedmont and Rome from 6 infantry and 2 artillery each to 3 infantry and 2 artillery. The Italian army is frankly overpowered at the start of the game. The knock-on effect of this is that it's usually able to move in force into Tyrolia or Trieste in such a fashion that the Austrians are knocked back so hard and economically so hurt that it can be fatal to the Central Powers early in the game. Removing these 6 pieces doesn't preclude the Italians from making aggressive actions. It just makes these actions far more balanced and far more risky. The Italians can and might still want to push into these 4 IPC value territories. It's just that the decisions and the counterattacks become far more interesting and far more entertaining for both sides. So just to recap this very quickly, I believe that Axis and Allies 1914 is, or very nearly is, balanced when requiring the Russian Revolution rule to be in play, when having the USA start at 0 IPCs and enter the war at the beginning of USA turn 5 unless attacked first, when the invasion of neutral territories that did not start the game aligned is no longer permitted, with the necessary exception being Persia, when the Dardanelles is closed to through sea movement unless the capital of Constantinople is under Entente control, when the border between C-Zones 17 and 18 is moved from the boot heel of Italy to between Albania and Greece, and when the Italian armies in both Piedmont and Rome are reduced each by 3 infantry. Before I leave this segment of the video, I want to say that I feel very strongly that these optional rules address the core issues of imbalance in Axis and Allies 1914. And I believe this such that if anyone at Renegade Games, which is the current game company that owns the title for Axis and Allies, sees this video and feels the same way, that they're welcome to lift some or all of these and release them in an official errata. My recommendation would be to list them as official optional rules to be added in a la carte by all the players before sitting down to play a game. And I wouldn't care 1 iota for credit. My only interest is preserving as much of the original flavor of the game while at the same time making it more balanced. That's it for this segment. Let's go ahead and move into the Q&A. Before I get into questions and answers, I want to cover one of the more confusing rules of Axis and Allies 1914. So I'm going to demonstrate this by example. We have a contested zone in Venice with some Italians and Austrians fighting it out, and Americans have moved up to support. Let's say it's the USA turn and they want to withdraw from this position. Unfortunately, in this case, they cannot. So I'm going to read this rule out of the updated rulebook. This is under Phase 2 movement, land units. Land units that begin your turn in contested territories can only be moved to territories that at the beginning of your turn were either controlled by your power or contained units belonging to your power. And the key word here is your power. Since the USA does not actually control Piedmont or Tuscany, they're controlled by Italy, and there are no USA units in either of these territories, the only way these US troops can get out is to load up on a transport. To alleviate this situation, the US player would want to have at least one troop in either Tuscany or Piedmont. This would allow those troops freedom of movement to any territory that had US troops in it. I only mention this because between the original rulebook and the errata, and how subtly expressed this rule is without an example in the rulebook, this is probably the most misunderstood and perhaps completely missed rule of the game. Let's now move to the Q&A. I didn't talk too much about tanks in my strategic video, so I'll go ahead and discuss them here. Tanks are offensive units that I feel are a necessity for Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the United Kingdom. I don't think they're of much use to any other power. And the reason for that is Germany needs to begin an assault on France in the mid-game, Austria-Hungary needs to begin an assault on Italy by the mid-game, and the United Kingdom needs to be assaulting the Ottoman Empire as quickly as possible. The other powers are for the most part on defense, and furthermore, I feel that I've unriddled the mystery behind this unit and why it's needed in this game. And that has to do with the fact that land units are only placed in the capitals for each power. I'm going to do my best to demonstrate this with a quick example. Let's say that it's turn 6, that Russia has fallen, and now Germany must turn its attention west towards France. The fighting usually starts out around here in the Ruhr and Alsace area. But once Germany leans its economic might into this one area of the map, it's likely the German army will slowly grind forward and move closer to the capital of Paris. And this actually ends up being something of an advantage for the French. Units the French produce when they're closer to their capital will immediately go into the fighting, whereas units that Germany produces back in Berlin will take several turns to get there. Enter the tank. The ability of this unit to shrug off hits helps preserve the health of your forward army in its attacks. If any of the aforementioned powers do not build tanks, they are likely doomed. The economics of the game and the dynamics of the battlefield itself demand that the attacker have armor. So if you buy that, the next question might be, well, how many should I get? And at the time of this recording, I feel that this largely has to do with how many infantry your army is composed of. My preferred ratio at this moment is to have one tank for every 8 to 10 infantry. Compared to tanks, fighters are far more intuitive and easy to understand, so I won't say too much about them, but I will highlight two areas where I see less experienced players make mistakes. First is to understand that this unit is the only unit that isn't bound by the movement restrictions of a contested zone. Fighters can fly 2 spaces anywhere so long as there's an infantry unit from its side when it gets there. Full stop. The other thing I feel I see a lot of is a misunderstanding about the probabilities of fighter combat. And the bottom line up front is that if you have even one more fighter than your enemy, you're far more likely to win that fight than they are. So I'm going to put up a chart here. You can see the ratios for yourself. The way to read this is a percentage of win, loss, and draw for everything from 2 versus 1 all the way to 10 versus 9. Again, notice how significant the percentages are for the player who has even one more fighter. At this point, I feel that when I see someone attack a group of fighters that's larger than theirs, they're either extraordinarily desperate or ignorant of this information. For anyone who's never heard of this, if you Googled Axis and Allies 1914 house rules that help balance the game, this rule or a variant of it would pop up at some point in your search. And in the fewest amount of words, what this does is restrict the amount of pieces the United Kingdom player can build out of India. Instead of being allowed unlimited builds, it's usually restricted to a number around 6. Advocates of this rule like it because they feel that it makes the game a little more historical, given that the British weren't forming up large armies and marching through Persia into Mesopotamia to attack the Ottomans. And they feel that it makes the game a bit more balanced because the Ottoman Empire player now has a chance to survive, or otherwise have a greater effect on the game. So here's why I advocate for not using this optional rule. First, after my many playings of this game, it's become obvious to me that the game designers really wanted the fall of the Ottoman Empire scripted into the game. And I feel strongly that the ability of the UK player to place pieces in India is integral to that happening. And so by limiting the amount of builds here, it can severely hamper or even negate that from happening. I think that the fighting between the Ottomans and the British is interesting enough as it is with out-of-box rules, and that this does very little to alter balance in any way. Because the British have two areas for which they can place units, a clever UK player merely needs to adjust his strategy to achieve the same result. So in summation, I feel that this fouls with one of the more interesting scripts in the game and really doesn't do much by way of balance at all. In all the games that I've played of Axis and Allies 1914, I've seen this done once with one submarine in one game. And that was me. I did this with a single German sub that my Entente opponent was ignoring. I couldn't think of anything else for it to do, so I put it in C-Zone 7 and rolled a single dice. My opponent then immediately destroyed it, and though it is in my mind often when I'm playing as the Central Powers, I believe this to be a nearly useless rule. That's it. I really don't have anything else to say about this. Axis and Allies 1914 is a great game, despite this funny rule. I'll go ahead and link the tournament rules in the description box below. I haven't yet played this variant of Axis and Allies 1914. I will say that when the CP win this game, it usually takes between 16 and 20 turns to do so. And though the turns aren't as long as they can be for something like Global 40, this is still quite a bit, and so it makes sense to me that the game designers would develop something like that. But when you read through this, you realize that this is a far different game compared to the out-of-box rules. So I have to default to no comment. For me to develop an opinion on this, I would need to play at least 10 to 20 games, and I just haven't yet done so, so I may revisit this rule set in a future video. In this final segment of the video, I'm going to give some well-earned shoutouts to a few of the players that helped make this video series possible. It was just shy of a year ago now when I put out an announcement video that I'd be making a series for 1914. I made a short video asking for opponents from the community to help me out with that, and I got exactly one person to respond from that initial video. So my first shout out goes out to the veteran. He actually has a YouTube channel, which I will link in the description box below, but he and I ended up playing something like 10 or 11 games, and he was tenacious. As soon as one game ended, we would start up another and go again. We were still both kind of learning the rules and trying to navigate the strange world of 1914. But we both adapted and overcame, and he's probably one of the more lethal Entente players that I've played against. So thank you to the veteran for sticking with it and putting in all of those games. My next shout out goes to a fellow who goes by Dooman McGee on AxisandAllies.org forums. This was somebody who I knew to be a thoughtful and experienced Axis and Allies 1914 player. He and I played about 3 or 4 games, and whatever benefit there is to the video in this series titled The Russia Revolution Rule goes to him. In fact, that critical example in that video was the game that he and I played. The Russian Revolution Rule is not easily understood, and as I've said in a previous video on this channel, if you're gonna get your butt kicked, get it kicked by people who are better than you. Because thanks to him, after those 3 or 4 games, I had a very good understanding of that rule and its implication on the game. My next shout out goes to one of the larger channels of Axis and Allies, and that is the Hilltop Pillbox. In the process of making this series, I was looking at what other content creators for Axis and Allies had said about 1914. I issued challenges to about 3 or 4 of the larger channels that talk about Axis and Allies 1914, and none of them responded, except for the Hilltop Pillbox. Not only did he respond, but he immediately played a game. That guy has a channel that's 5 times the size of this one. He did not have to spend the time to come and do that, and he did. And I have an incredible amount of respect for people who play Axis and Allies against human opponents. So I'm going to just declare right now that Hilltop Pillbox is an official friend of this channel. That guy is not afraid to stack games. And this leads me to my 4th and final shout out. This is the 3rd time I've done a deep dive on a version of Axis and Allies. Typically, this means that I end up playing the side that has the imbalance, and I become usually very good at playing that side. This is the first time where I met something like a fellow traveler who wanted to take the disadvantaged side and see what he could do with it. So if you run into or challenge a player by the name of Ragnell804 on AxisAndAllies.org, it's my opinion that he is probably the most lethal Central Powers player at the time of the release of this video. Not only that, but I'll share this quick story. It turned out he had some work training down in San Diego. I live outside of LA. He let me know that he'd be in my area. I said, well, it's about an hour and 50-minute drive and I can't drive to you. And he didn't even blink. That guy showed up the next day ready to play, and I even managed to shoot one picture. Of course, I didn't even think to include both of us in the shot. There's something about playing a game of Axis and Allies and just getting totally distracted by getting into the game and forgetting to do basic things like this, but it was a ripping good time, and a lion's share of the credit goes to him not only for the support throughout this whole process, but for helping out and contributing with the rules recommendations for balance. If I had the time, I would give shoutouts to everybody for this series of 1914. It was really an incredible experience. The 1914 crowd, these 11 opponents that I played against, were distinct from the anniversary and the classic players. These guys all had really positive attitudes, were incredibly dedicated, and just a joy to play. Thank you to all those who helped make this video series possible. And with that, I'm going to close out not only this video, but this series. The purpose of these videos was to hopefully give competitive opening strategies for each power, and to hopefully help players understand some of the unique rules differences of this game compared to the other versions of Axis and Allies. To that end, I hope it was helpful or at least entertaining. Thank you for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.